38a in Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. You cannot talk about race, vicious legacies of white supremacy. You can't talk about gender and vicious legacies of male supremacy. You cannot talk about capitalism and the rule of capital over workers, which too often makes it difficult for working people to gain access to lives of decency and dignity. You can't talk about empire. We began with an acknowledgement of our very precious and priceless indigenous peoples. And in acknowledging that, it's not just a symbolic gesture, but it's a reminder of the subordination, the violence, the dispossession. And yes, we must work with what we've got, indeed. But first, to talk about the tradition that produced me in regard to race matters is not to begin with discussions about policy and politics. No, these are deep spiritual and moral issues. It has to do with the examined life. The Greek actually says the unexamined life is not a life for the human. And we know our English human derives from the Latin humando, H-U-M-A-N-D-O. And humando means burial and burying, that we are beings on the way to burial. And to talk about race is to raise the question, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? Boy, that really brings us together in terms of our commonality, doesn't it? And most importantly, as Plato says, learning how to die in order to learn how to live. That has everything to do with wrestling with what it means to be human and contesting, responding to the vicious legacy of white supremacy and other evils. We could talk about the anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Arab hatred, anti-Palestinian hatred, hatred of women, hatred of gays, hatred of lesbians, hatred of bisexuals, hatred of trans, hate across the board. But I'm zeroing in on white supremacy. I just want you to know that we need a universal vision when you're talking about what it means to be human. This issue of coming to terms with death is a crucial one. When Montaigne says to philosophize is to learn how to die, or when Seneca says he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. We can't even begin to talk about race unless we begin with the spiritual and moral dimensions of who we are. It's never a question of name calling and finger pointing. It begins with one's own self. That's the Socratic moment. 1% of the population own 40% of the wealth, and it is escalating all the time. But Professor West, isn't it the case that the statistics look so good, the economy's in magnificent shape? Given the statistical view of the economy, yes. Given the human view of the economy, there's still catastrophe. I still live in a country. 1 out of 2 children of color, black and brown, under 6 years old, live in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. That's a moral disgrace. Spiritually obscene that the most innocent could still be locked into poverty. You see, hardly any discourse about it. Any party. Why? Because to live in a world of denial is to live lives on the surface, the superficial levels of spectacle and image, as opposed to substance, moral substance, spiritual content. What kinds of quality of lives are people living in those hoods, in those barrios, on those reservations? white poor in Appalachia, white working people so confused that they would choose a billionaire so deeply tied to big money, big military, and I would say mediocre, but that would be a compliment. And what has been distinctive in the history of those who have tried to speak directly to race matters, like the Frederick Douglasses, like the Ella Bakers, like Martin Luther King Jr., is that they always started on a moral and spiritual plane and then engaged in trying to shatter the forms of evasion and avoidance of coming to terms with the suffering and the misery of those whose humanity was called into question. It was not primarily, or I should say preeminently, political. It was driven by a certain moral and spiritual force that allowed them to intervene in the political matter. But with spiritual blackout or spiritual whiteout, it's all power, 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 interest groups, interest groups, interest groups. Whoever has the power wins. We're back to Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Might makes right, and whoever has the might is right. Or as Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, if you view life like a gold rush, you're going to end up worshiping a golden calf. And the golden rule becomes he or she who has the gold, usually a he in the patriarchal world. He who has the gold makes the rules. Everywhere you go, it's just a matter of brand, brand, brand. Thank God I was raised in such a way. And talking about race matters, I never have a brand. I come from a people who were branded for 244 years with a concrete brand as they were enslaved. I got a cause, I don't have a brand. I got a calling, I don't just have a profession. I have a vocation, I don't just have upward mobility. So there was time to sacrifice for something. Give me integrity rather than popularity. Give me integrity rather than cupidity. At least I go to the grave with a smile on my face saying I'm trying to be true to grandma and granddad and those folk who shaped me in such a way that I would just be decent rather than rich, or wise rather than just smart. I see students all the time at Harvard. It may not be the case, University of British Columbia. You all further along in this regard. Oh, I got the students and I got to be the smartest in the room. No, don't worry about being smart. Let the phones be smart, you be wise. A lot of smart white supremacists, a lot of smart misogynists, a lot of smart anti-Jewish folk, anti-Arab folk. Where's the wisdom? Where's the compassion? Where's the empathy? That's what's required in talking about race matters, class matters, gender matters, empire matters. Homophobia matters. And yet our young folk drifting. Many trying to bounce back. Black Lives Movement, very important indeed. Me Too movement, very important indeed. Best of the trade union movement, as weak and feeble as it is, but still trying to fight back. Anti-militaristic movement, very crucial. And that's precisely what the best University of British Columbia, 13 years now in the making, rich prehistory with its own educational institutions, but 13 years in the making, trying to say, fellow students, whosoever will, Canadian, non-Canadian, across the board, come to terms with race matters and gender matters and empire matters and class matters and homophobia matters. Really learn how to die so when you graduate, you won't just say, I went to college, but also say, a college went through me. So you become more empowered, ennobled, humbled, broadened, more mature, more willing to take a risk and pay a cost, more willing to learn and listen with an intellectual humility, but also an intellectual tenacity. Humility is always the benchmark of spiritual maturity connected to tenacity. That's the history of black people at our best in America. And if we don't revive it in the next 5 to 10 years, you can rest assured that the curtain will be brought down on a precious democratic experiment called the USA that never came to terms with its empire, never came to terms with its white and male supremacy, never came to terms with this predatory capitalism in which a 1% could live lives of luxury and others barely gaining access, too many others barely gaining access to necessities. And that's what we're fighting against. And for me, it's always a question of not so much talking about just winning, but it's a matter of talking about what kind of human being I want to choose to be in the short time that I'm here, so that I have to come to terms with the white supremacy inside of me, the male supremacy inside of me, the xenophobia inside of me, and try to kill it every day. Can't do it alone. You need comrades, friends, partners, family to help you kill it every day, to reconquer it every day, as Faust says in Goethe's classic. And do we have the capacity as a nation? Do we have the capacity as a species? That is an open question. But we need no guarantees in order to choose decency and dignity. I hope we so choose. Thank you all so very much.